History is never just a record of events. It is a battlefield, a place where nations fight not with guns or aircraft, but with textbooks, public memory, and the stories they choose to tell the next generation. And few nations today are engaged in a struggle over their past as intensely as Japan. The Second World War ended 80 years ago, but in Japan, the fight over what really happened, what should be remembered, what should be taught, and what should be forgotten continues to rage with a quiet but fierce intensity. It's a conflict fought in classrooms, in museums, in political speeches, in documentary films, and increasingly on social media. It is a war over memory, identity, and national pride. It is a war that shapes how Japan sees itself and how the world sees Japan. To understand how Japan arrived at this moment, you have to go back to the immediate aftermath of World War II. In 1945, Japan was a shattered nation, reduced to ruins, humiliated, and occupied. For many Japanese civilians, what they remembered most vividly was not what their country had done abroad, but what they themselves had experienced. Firebombs raining down on their cities, children starving, soldiers returning home as broken shells of men, and finally, the blinding flash at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. In the years that followed, these memories would become the emotional core of Japan's self-understanding. The Japanese people suffered. The Japanese people were victims. The Japanese people endured something catastrophic. For many, the atrocities committed by Japanese forces across Asia felt distant. Events that happened in other lands, experienced by other people, outside the frame of everyday Japanese life. And so from the very beginning, Japan's memory of the war was divided. Internal suffering versus external aggression. Victimhood versus responsibility. When Japan regained sovereignty in 1952, this divide only deepened. The Cold War was reshaping Asia, and the United States, now Japan's ally, was far more interested in rebuilding Japan as a capitalist bulwark against communism than in forcing it to fully confront its wartime actions. The U.S. occupation allowed many wartime bureaucrats, officers, and politicians to return to public life. These men carried with them not only the institutions of pre-war Japan, but also the interpretations and narratives they had lived by. To them, Japan had not waged the barbaric war of conquest. It had fought to liberate Asia from Western colonialism, to defend itself against Western encirclement, and to claim its rightful place as a modern power. This interpretation, often called the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity narrative, did not disappear after the war. It simply went underground, waiting for a moment when it could re-emerge. That moment came in the 1980s. Japan was booming. Its economy was unstoppable. Its corporations dominated global markets, and its political establishment felt confident, assertive, and eager to reshape the country's international image. Conservative politicians and nationalist intellectuals began to argue that Japan had been unfairly judged after the war, that the Tokyo war crimes trials were victor's justice, and that the world had misunderstood Japan's intentions. This movement was not fringe. It included high-ranking Diet members, best-selling authors, textbook reform groups, and influential journalists. They pushed for school textbooks that portrayed Japan not as an aggressor, but as a country that made mistakes under difficult circumstances. They wanted to emphasize Japanese suffering, especially the atomic bombings. They objected to words like invasion, massacre, or sex slaves. They wanted a proud Japan, not a guilty Japan. But if the 1980s were a time of rising nationalist confidence, the 1990s were a decade of reckoning. Japan's economy crashed, and as the bubble era burst, the country entered its long stagnation. With this economic decline came a shift in political tone. Japan's neighbors, China, South Korea, the Philippines, began to demand clearer acknowledgments of wartime atrocities. The Cold War was over, and suppressed stories were emerging. Nanjing Massacre, Unit 731, forced labor, biological experiments, and the horrific system of comfort women. Survivors were aging, desperate to speak before their voices faded forever. The global spread of human rights discourse gave their testimonies new urgency, and Japan, suddenly vulnerable and unsure of its future, found itself caught between two narratives, one that sought to acknowledge wrongdoing and one that sought to defend the nation's honor. This tension erupted in what historians now call the History Wars, a struggle that continues to this day. At the center of these wars lies one of the most contested objects in modern Japan, the humble school textbook. Every few years, when new history textbooks are approved, a political storm erupts. Conservative groups like the Japanese Society for History Textbook Reform accuse mainstream books of being masochistic or anti-Japanese. They claim that focusing on atrocities teaches children to hate their own country. They push for textbooks that soften language. Invasion becomes advance. Massacre becomes incident. Forced labor becomes mobilization. Comfort women disappear entirely. Meanwhile, progressive scholars and teachers fight back, insisting that sanitizing the past is not patriotism, it is propaganda. This battle over textbooks is about far more than what children read. It is about who controls the national story. Because in Japan, the past is political. And the most explosive flashpoint in this narrative war is a place called Yasukani Shrine. Yasukani is a Shinto shrine in Tokyo dedicated to Japan's war dead. But on its grounds is a museum, the Yushukan, that presents a radically revisionist view of World War II. Here, Japan is depicted as a heroic nation resisting Western imperialism. The invasion of Asia is reframed as self-defense. The Nanjing massacre is downplayed. The comfort women are barely mentioned. And because several convicted Class A war criminals are enshrined there, every visit by Japanese politicians, especially prime ministers, sparks international outrage. For conservative, Yasukani is a sacred place, a symbol of national pride. For progressives, it's a monument to denial. For China and South Korea, it's an open wound. And for historians, it is the clearest proof of how divided Japan's memory remains. But the history wars are not just about textbooks and shrines. They're also fought in cinema, television dramas, manga, and documentaries. Films like The Eternal Zero depict Japanese pilots as tragic heroes. Dramas about the war focus on the suffering of civilians, especially mothers and children. Manga and anime often portray Japanese soldiers as reluctant fighters or victims of circumstance. These narratives are not false, but they are incomplete. They highlight one part of the war while minimizing another. And slowly, subtly, they shape the collective memory of millions. But what makes Japan's history wars unique is that the country is not united behind a single narrative. It is torn between several competing ones. There is the nationalist narrative, which paints Japan as misunderstood and unfairly judged. The pacifist narrative, which emphasizes the horrors of war and rejects militarism entirely. The victim narrative, centered on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The reckoning narrative, supported by historians who insist that truth must come before pride. And the geopolitical narrative, shaped by Japan's domestic politics and Asian influence. These narratives overlap, collide, and contradict each other. The result is a national memory that is neither fully repentant nor fully revisionist. In the 21st century, the battlefield of memory has expanded even further. Digital nationalism, online activism, AI-generated content, and viral misinformation amplify the struggle. Every documentary sparks counter-documentaries. Every apology triggers backlash. Every politician's statement goes global within minutes. Social media has turned the past into a living, breathing political fight, one that never dies. And the stakes today are higher than ever. Japan is rearming. Its military budget is rising. Its geopolitical position in East Asia is increasingly precarious. And as Japan moves toward a more assertive future, the question of how it tells its past becomes even more important for its identity, its diplomacy, and its moral standing in the world. Because the real question behind the history wars is not simply what happened. It is who gets to decide what happened. And more importantly, what does Japan want to believe about itself now?
The question of how Japan teaches World War II to its children is not just a matter of education. It is a matter of power. Every nation tries to tell its younger generations a story that binds them together. But in Japan, those stories do not simply unify, they divide. They clash, they provoke, and they reveal the deep fractures that still run through the country's understanding of its wartime past. In some countries, history is a stable foundation. In Japan, it is an earthquake fault that shifts every few years, whenever a new textbook is published or a new controversy breaks across the headlines. The tension begins with a simple fact. In Japan, no single history textbook is used nationwide. Schools choose from multiple state-approved books. That may sound harmless, but in practice, it opens the door to fierce competition between different ideological groups. On one side are mainstream historians and educators who want to teach a comprehensive, documented view of Japan's wartime conduct, one that includes atrocities, colonialism, and militarism. On the other side are conservative organizations, such as the Japanese Society for History Textbook Reform, who argue that decades of education have taught children to be ashamed of their own country. To them, Japan needs pride-based education, a curriculum that minimizes wrongdoing and emphasizes noble intentions. The first major eruption in this battlefield came in the early 1980s. In 1982, it was discovered that Japan's Ministry of Education had requested that publishers soften descriptions of wartime actions, replacing words like aggression with more neutral terms. This sparked international outrage. China and South Korea protested ferociously. Japan's government scrambled to respond. And under pressure, the ministry revised its approval process, allowing some honesty to return to the books. But the damage had been done. The world saw a Japan that appeared to be whitewashing its past. And conservatives, angered by foreign criticism, doubled their efforts to defend what they saw as Japan's honor. By the late 1990s, this nationalist movement had grown sophisticated, coordinated, and well-funded. Their flagship project was a new textbook, a book designed to present Japan's wartime actions in the most defensive, contextualized, and patriotic light possible. It downplayed atrocities, it questioned established historical accounts, it reframed Japan's expansion as a response to Western imperialism, and it presented terms like Nanking Massacre as disputed or exaggerated. When the book was approved in 2001, an uproar shook East Asia. China denounced it. South Korea condemned it. Hundreds of thousands of protesters took to the streets. Japanese embassies were attacked. But inside Japan, the reaction was mixed. Many teachers refused to adopt the book, seeing it as an insult to historical truth. Yet for nationalists, the book was a triumph, a symbol that their interpretation of history could be legitimized. The key battleground within this conflict is language. Words are political weapons, and in Japanese textbooks, single words carry enormous meaning. Consider the term shinrikaku, invasion. Nationalists argue it is too harsh. They prefer shinshutsu, advance, or nushin, entry, which sound neutral, almost bureaucratic. But for Chinese and Korean historians, replacing invasion with advance is not a matter of nuance, it is a denial of reality. It's like calling colonialism administration, or genocide population reduction. Language shapes memory, and memory shapes identity. And so every word in Japan's textbooks becomes a site of ideological struggle. Another flashpoint is the section on comfort women, the tens of thousands of women across Asia forced or coerced into sexual slavery for the Japanese military. For many years, progressive textbooks addressed this issue bluntly. But starting in the 2000s, conservative pressure increased dramatically. Nationalist groups claimed the system was voluntary. They said women were paid. They argued that the word sex slaves was too extreme. And by the 2010s, the mention of comfort women began to disappear from several textbooks, effectively erasing one of the most painful chapters of wartime history. This erasure is not accidental. It represents a deliberate attempt to reshape national memory by selectively forgetting. Despite all this, Japan is not a single-minded nation marching towards revisionism. In fact, the most fascinating aspect of the textbook wars is how divided Japan remains internally. Many Japanese teachers, especially in major cities, refuse to use nationalist textbooks. They rely on supplementary materials, eyewitness accounts, and independent research to ensure their students learn the full scope of wartime events. Some teachers take their classes to Hiroshima and Nagasaki to explore the consequences of militarism. Others bring in guest speakers, including former soldiers or survivors from occupied territories, to offer personal testimonies. In these classrooms, history becomes a bridge towards empathy. On the other hand, rural regions, conservative districts, or communities with strong nationalist sentiment may adopt textbooks that lean heavily towards patriotic interpretation. In these classrooms, history becomes a shield, not a mirror. Students learn about the suffering of Japanese citizens, especially the bombing of Tokyo and the atomic attacks. They learn about brave Japanese soldiers making noble sacrifices. But they may learn little about the Nanking Massacre, biological warfare experiments, or forced labor. This divergence creates a generational split within Japan. Two students growing up in different prefectures may learn two almost contradictory versions of the same war. And this internal divide raises deeper questions. What does it mean to be a nation if you can't agree on your past? Can a country build a stable identity when its historical foundation is fractured? Or does this plurality of memory actually reflect Japan's complex reality? A nation both victim and aggressor, both wounded and wounding, both repentant and defensive. These questions become even more urgent when you consider the role of international pressure. China and South Korea regularly condemn Japan's attempts to soften its wartime past. But within Japan, foreign criticism sometimes has the opposite effect of what was intended. Many Japanese people resent being lectured by countries they feel harbor their own historical contradictions. Others argue that Japan has apologized enough, and that constant demands for further contrition keep wounds open rather than healing them. This resentment fuels nationalist rhetoric. It strengthens the argument that Japan should control its own narrative without foreign interference. And it adds fuel to the ongoing domestic conflict over how history should be taught. Meanwhile, global geopolitics complicate the conversation. Japan's allies with the United States shapes what can and cannot be said in school curricula. The U.S. has no interest in encouraging narratives that highlight its own wartime actions, especially the atomic bombings. American occupation policies after the war also suppressed certain Japanese voices, including left-wing and pacifist groups that could have pushed harder for full accountability. And so the story Japan tells today is shaped not only by Japanese politics, but also by decades of American influence, Cold War priorities, and diplomatic concerns. In recent years, the rise of digital media has transformed the textbook wars into something even bigger, a globalized battle of narratives. YouTube channels, online forums, nationalist websites, and algorithm-driven content circulate revisionist interpretations with unprecedented reach. Infographics and short videos simplify complex history into easily digestible and often misleading messages. Some are produced by fringe groups. Others are backed by political organizations. Millions of young people encounter these narratives before they ever read a textbook. And so, the war over Japan's past is no longer confined to schools. It has moved to TikTok, Twitter, Reddit, and YouTube, where attention, not accuracy, determines what survives. Yet, amidst all this polarization, something remarkable is also happening. A new generation of Japanese scholars, artists, filmmakers, and activists are challenging both extremes. They reject the nationalist desire to sanitize history, but they also reject the reductive foreign view that portrays Japan only as a villain. They seek a more balanced understanding, one that acknowledges wrongdoing without erasing context, one that honors victims without demonizing the entire nation, one that accepts responsibility without sacrificing identity. Their work is less about guilt and more about maturity, a belief that a nation can only move forward when it knows itself honestly. Because in the end, the textbook wars are about much more than pages or paragraphs. They are about the soul of a country. They are about how Japan teaches its children what it means to be Japanese. They are about whether history is a story of shame, pride, or something deeper, something that transcends both. And as the fight continues, the question remains: will Japan choose to confront the complexities of its past, or will it continue to wage war against its own memory?
If the textbook battlefield shapes how young Japanese people learn their history, the battlefield of public memory shapes how the world sees Japan and how Japan sees itself. In Part 3, the conflict expands from classrooms to streets, from pages to monuments, from quiet academic debates to highly public diplomatic storms. Because in Japan, history does not live only in books. It lives in shrines, memorials, statues, political ceremonies, and the rituals of national mourning. It lives in what is remembered and what is not. And in every country that has lived through war, these symbols matter. But in Japan, they matter so intensely that a single political visit or a single statue erected abroad can ignite international controversy and renew decades-old wounds. At the center of this landscape stands Yasukuni Shrine, perhaps the most politically charged religious site in the modern world. Built in the late 19th century to commemorate Japan's war dead, it houses the spirits of soldiers who died fighting for the emperor. For many Japanese conservatives, it is a sacred place, a symbol of sacrifice, loyalty, and national dignity. For liberals, it is a reminder of militarism's darkest legacy, a place entangled with nationalism and denial. But for China, South Korea, and much of the broader international community, it is something much deeper, an affront, a provocation, and in their eyes, a monument that glorifies aggression. This is because among the 2.5 million souls enshrined at Yasukuni are 14 Class A war criminals, including wartime Prime Minister Hideki Tojo. Their inclusion, done quietly in 1978, turned the shrine from a site of mourning into a geopolitical fault line. Every time a Japanese cabinet minister visits Yasukuni, diplomatic shockwaves ripple across East Asia. Beijing condemns the visit as an attempt to whitewash atrocities. Seoul sees it as a rejection of wartime accountability. Even Washington, Japan's closest ally, often expresses disappointment, carefully couched in diplomatic language. Yet inside Japan, the reactions differ dramatically. Some citizens see the visits as a necessary act of remembrance. Others see them as irresponsible and dangerously nationalistic. This duality reflects the broader identity struggle within Japan. The shrine is not merely a religious site, it is a symbol of contested memory. Equally controversial is Yushukan, the military museum adjacent to the shrine. Walking through its halls is like walking through an alternate version of history. Displays present Japan's wars not as campaigns of conquest, but as noble struggles for self-defense and Asian liberation. The Pacific War becomes the Greater East Asia War, reframed as Japan's attempt to free Asia from Western imperialism. The attack on Pearl Harbor is described as a strategic necessity, not an act of aggression. Atrocities are minimized or omitted. The tone is heroic, nationalistic, defiant. And while the museum attracts tourists and school groups, it also attracts heavy criticism. For many scholars, it represents revisionism in its purest form, a carefully constructed narrative designed to reshape national memory through emotional and visual persuasion. It reveals how deeply the history wars have seeped into cultural spaces. But monuments do not only exist in Japan. They exist in Korea, China, the Philippines, Indonesia, and beyond, in every place touched by Japan's wartime expansion. In Seoul, the Comfort Woman statues stand as solemn reminders of trauma. One such statue stands directly across from the Japanese embassy, a silent child cast in bronze, seated in a chair next to an empty one, symbolizing absence, loss, and unresolved grief. For South Korea, these statues represent truth and justice. For Japan's conservatives, they represent political weaponization of history. As more statues were erected around the world, in the United States, Australia, Germany, and Canada, Japan protested, insisting that such memorials damaged diplomatic relations and perpetuated one-sided narratives. But for survivors and activists, these statues are not diplomatic tools. They're acts of remembrance. The battle over comfort women extends far beyond statues. It involves court cases, international petitions, academic journals, and public demonstrations. In some cases, Japanese nationalists have campaigned to remove or modify statues, arguing that the historical record is exaggerated. In response, activists have doubled down, gathering testimonies, organizing marches, and publishing research. What began as a humanitarian issue has become a symbol of the wider struggle over wartime memory and moral responsibility. Yet Japan is not alone in navigating complex wartime legacies. South Korea and China also engage in politics of memory, using historical grievances to reinforce nationalism, justify foreign policy positions, or rally domestic support. This does not invalidate their historical claims, but it complicates the narrative. History becomes entangled with political rhetoric. Memory becomes a tool. Victimhood becomes a resource. And in this charged environment, every historical debate becomes a proxy war for modern power struggles. This is why Japan's history wars cannot be understood solely as internal affairs. They are deeply global. For example, the Nanjing Massacre, a 6-week killing spree by Japanese troops in 1937, remains one of the most disputed events in East Asian history. Mainstream historians estimate around 200,000 to 300,000 victims. Some Japanese conservatives reject these numbers, framing the massacre as exaggerated or fabricated by post-war tribunals. Chinese state media, in turn, amplifies the highest estimates and uses the tragedy as a centerpiece of national unity and anti-Japanese sentiment. Between denial and exaggeration lies the truth, immense suffering that deserves careful study, not political manipulation. And yet politics often prevails. The diplomacy of remembrance also extends to Hiroshima and Nagasaki. In Western narratives, the atomic bombings are framed as necessary to end the war. In Japan, they are framed as national trauma, often overshadowing Japan's role as aggressor. Some critics argue that Japan's emphasis on its victimhood creates a distorted memory, one that underplays its responsibility in the events that led to the bombings. Others argue that acknowledging Japanese suffering does not negate the suffering Japan inflicted throughout Asia. The truth is not binary. It's layered, painful, and morally complex. But the history wars often simplify it for political convenience. This tension shapes Japan's domestic politics as well. Politicians frequently rely on historical rhetoric to energize their base. Some speak of restoring national pride, revising the constitution, or strengthening the self-defense forces. Others emphasize reconciliation, pacifism, and global cooperation. In this ideological battle, history becomes a weapon for shaping the future. Conservative leaders often say, we must teach a history our children can be proud of. But critics respond, we must teach a history our children can learn from. Pride and responsibility, honor and accountability. These values collide in parliamentary debates, media coverage, and public opinion. Within Japanese society, generational dynamics add another layer. Older generations grew up closer to the war, hearing stories from parents and grandparents. Younger generations, however, often feel more distant. To them, the war is abstract, a historical event with little bearing on their modern lives. As survivors pass away, living memory fades. And when memory fades, often myth rushes in to fill the void. This is why educators, activists, and historians fear that the truth may erode over time if not actively preserved. Yet Japan is also home to powerful movements for remembrance and reconciliation. Peace museums in Okinawa confront the horrors of the Battle of Okinawa with unflinching honesty. Hiroshima's Peace Memorial Museum documents the atomic bombings with stark detail while promoting global disarmament. Independent filmmakers and authors produce works that explore the war's darker chapters, often winning praise abroad, even when controversial at home. Meanwhile, Japanese NGOs collaborate with Korean and Chinese groups to preserve testimonies, promote dialogue, and build bridges across national divides. These efforts reveal another Japan, one committed to introspection, humility, and historical truth. Still, the forces of denial and minimization persist. Some revisionists argue that Japan is unfairly singled out while other nations escape scrutiny. They ask why Soviet crimes, Chinese political repression, or Western colonial violence receive less attention. They ask why Japan must continue apologizing when generations have passed. These arguments resonate with some citizens, particularly those who feel national pride has been suppressed since 1945. But critics reply that acknowledgement is not punishment, it is responsibility. Every nation must confront its past honestly, and Japan's position as a major democratic power gives it a moral obligation to lead, not retreat. International pressure continues to influence the debate. China commemorates wartime events with large national ceremonies. South Korea's courts and government remain deeply invested in wartime labor and comfort women cases. American human rights organizations advocate for historical transparency, and global academic institutions conduct extensive research into Japan's imperial era. The result is a complex tug-of-war between domestic narratives and global expectations. Each side views the past through its own lens, shaped by political needs and cultural memory. But perhaps the most powerful element of the memory offensive is silence, the things that are not said. Many Japanese families do not discuss the war. Many veterans never spoke of what they saw. Many survivors, burdened by guilt or trauma, remained quiet for decades.
It becomes an invisible force shaping national identity. The absence of conversation becomes part of the story. Japan's history wars are not only about facts, they are about meaning. They are about how a nation wants to remember itself. They are about what kinds of heroes and victims are chosen to define the collective past. They are about the power of symbols, the politics of mourning, and the diplomacy of memory. And they reveal that the deepest battle over Japan's wartime legacy is not being fought between nations, but within Japan itself. The history war is often described as a struggle over the past, but in Japan, its most profound consequences lie in the future. Part 4 explores how these conflicts over narrative, memory, and responsibility shape Japan's national identity, its politics, its military direction, and its place in the global order. Because in Japan, the past is never just a past. It is a compass, a weapon, a burden, and a battlefield, one that continues to redefine who the country is, who it wants to be, and how the world sees it. Modern Japan stands at a crossroads. On one side are those who believe the nation must fully confront its wartime actions, embrace historical responsibility, and build a future based on transparency, peace, and regional reconciliation. On the other side are those who argue that Japan has apologized enough, that its image has been unfairly tarnished, and that a firmer, more proud national narrative is needed to give confidence to the next generation. Between these two poles lies a vast middle ground of citizens who simply want stability, people who did not live through the war, did not create the atrocities, and yet inherit the consequences. In recent decades, Japan's political landscape has increasingly been influenced by this cultural divide. The Liberal Democratic Party, LDP, which has governed Japan for most of the post-war period, contains strong nationalist elements advocating constitutional reform, especially regarding Article 9, the clause that renounces war. For them, revisioning history is not merely about pride. It is about clearing the psychological constraints imposed by defeat. They believe that as long as Japan remains chained to a narrative of guilt, it will remain militarily and diplomatically constrained, dependent on foreign powers, and unable to fully defend itself in an increasingly unstable world. Meanwhile, opposition parties, along with many intellectuals and activists, argue that constitutional pacifism is not a burden but a moral achievement, a direct response to the horrors unleashed by militarism. They warn that revisionist history risks reviving dangerous ideologies, alienating neighbors, and eroding the hard-earned trust Japan has built as a peaceful democracy. They insist that honesty about the past is a prerequisite for genuine international respect, not an obstacle to it. These debates intensify with every geopolitical shift in East Asia. As China rises militarily and economically, Sino-Japanese tensions flare, making historical issues even more politically charged. In South Korea, historical disputes play a major role in elections, civic identity, and diplomatic policy. And in the United States, Japan's closest ally, conversations about military alliances and regional defense often intersect with discussions of wartime memory. Japan's past is not just part of its history,
It is a factor in international strategy. But the most powerful transformations are happening within Japan itself, especially among young people. For decades, Japanese youth were often described as apathetic about history, too distant from the war to feel personally connected. But in recent years, online communities, documentaries, global debates, and international student exchanges have sparked renewed interest. Younger generations are beginning to push back against silence. Many want transparency, not denial. They want to understand what happened, not inherit filtered stories. Some even argue that acknowledging the past is a path to national strength, not shame. At the same time, digital space is also amplifying nationalist voices, enabling revisionist narratives to reach millions with unprecedented speed. Memes, YouTube videos, and online forums can sometimes reinforce simplified, glorified versions of the past. As a result, Japanese youth are increasingly split, some embracing progressive global perspectives, others gravitating toward assertive nationalism. Another dimension of the history war involves Japanese veterans. As the last surviving soldiers of World War II age into their 90s and beyond, their testimonies become priceless and politically sensitive. Many veterans who once remained silent have begun to share their stories, describing the brutality they witnessed and sometimes committed. Their confessions challenge revisionist narratives, offering raw, first-hand accounts that undermine sanitized textbook portrayals. But with each passing year, more voices are lost. As the generation that lived through the war disappears, so does the moral immediacy of their memories. Their absence leaves an opening for myth, nostalgia, and political reinterpretation to take root. Equally significant is the perspective of Japanese mixed heritage families descended from Korean forced laborers, Taiwanese colonial subjects, or Chinese communities. These families live with a dual legacy: Japanese citizenship and historical trauma. Their stories, often absent from textbooks, embody the complexity of identity in a country that prides itself on homogeneity. Their experiences challenge the simplistic narratives that sometimes dominate public discourse, reminding Japan that history is not distant, it is personal. Meanwhile, Japan's cultural industries, film, literature, manga, and anime play an increasingly influential role in shaping public understanding of the war. Certain works, like the film Grave of the Fireflies, emphasize the suffering of ordinary Japanese civilians, reinforcing a victim-centered narrative. Others, like the manga Zapang, explore alternate histories where Japan's military might is revived. And still others offer nuanced portrayals of moral conflict and wartime responsibility. These cultural products often travel globally, influencing how international audiences view Japan and how Japan views itself. While some works challenge revisionism, others reinforce it, creating a cultural battlefield where competing interpretations vie for emotional resonance. Internationally, Japan's memory struggle continues to ripple through diplomacy. Each shift in historical narrative affects how Japan handles trade negotiations, security partnerships, and cultural exchanges. When Japanese governments appear to downplay wartime atrocities, China and South Korea respond with protests, sanctions, or public condemnations. In contrast, when Japan takes steps toward acknowledgement, such as official apologies or joint historical commissions, the diplomatic atmosphere improves dramatically. This cyclical pattern shows that history is not static dispute, but an active element of international relations. Yet despite the turbulence, there have been moments of hope. Joint textbooks authored by Japanese and Korean scholars, though controversial, represent efforts to bridge narratives. Survivors of wartime atrocities have met with Japanese students in projects organized by NGOs. Japanese volunteers have traveled to Korea and China to support preservation of war-related sites. These grassroots initiatives suggest that reconciliation is possible, not through politics alone, but through human connection. Still, one of the most complex battles lies in Japan's internal struggle between two visions of national identity. The first is the pacifist vision, rooted in humility, remorse, and a commitment to peace. This vision emphasizes Japan as a global humanitarian leader, a nation shaped by the tragedies of war and determined never to repeat them. It values transparency, self-reflection, and moral responsibility. The other vision is the revisionist nationalist vision, rooted in pride, strength, and sovereignty. This vision seeks to reframe Japan's wartime actions as defensive or misunderstood, rejecting what it sees as excessive guilt imposed by victors. They believe that so long as Japan remains chained to a narrative of guilt, it will remain militarily and diplomatically constrained, dependent on foreign powers, and unable to fully defend itself in an increasingly unstable world. These two visions clash in political campaigns, school boards, news debates, and even family conversations. The conflict is not simply about facts, but about identity, about what story Japan wants to tell about itself, and what kind of nation it aspires to be. Looking ahead, technology will play a major role in shaping the future of Japan's memory wars. Deepfakes, AI-generated textbooks, digital archives, and algorithm-driven information flows will influence how young people encounter history. Misinformation could spread faster than scholars can respond to it. At the same time, new technologies could preserve survivor testimonies, digitize historical documents, and democratize access to accurate research. Technology can distort memory or protect it. The outcome will depend on how Japan chooses to use these tools. Ultimately, Japan's history war reflects a universal truth. No country escapes the shadows of its past. Germany confronts its Holocaust legacy. The United States grapples with slavery and Native American genocide. Britain faces the realities of colonialism. China struggles with the memory of Tiananmen and Cultural Revolution violence. Every nation has chapters it would prefer to forget. Japan is not unique in this struggle. It is simply visible because its past intersects with so many others. The challenge Japan faces is not whether to remember, but how to remember. What the future holds depends on the choices Japan makes today. It can build a narrative grounded in honesty, empathy, and international cooperation, a narrative that acknowledges suffering without being defined by shame. Or it can choose a narrative shaped by denial, nationalism, and selective memory, a narrative that may inspire pride in the short term, but risks deepening regional divisions and historical distortions.